I'd like to basically moderate this panel looking at engaging both on equities and fixed income. And I'll kind of rest on Rob on the fixed income side and on Fassil on the equity side and on Archie on everything, effectively. And of course, when you're talking about engagement, you can't really leave the equity perspective away because that's where the legal claim sits. But I can tell you from quite a few asset owners that they also have an interest in engagement on the fixed income side. Unipension, for instance, does it very actively in Denmark. Hermes Equity Ownership Services, as biggest global engagement agent, also engages on bonds very actively. So the topic is absolutely coming. But as Archie said already in his introduction, the fixed income world and ESG is a little behind the equity world. And so it's fantastic to see such a well-attended event today. And I'd also like to focus on one of the words Lenora said, which is the a priori. Of course, things have to be prepared. Analysis have to be done ex ante. It makes no sense to do any analysis ex post, right? Ex post, the problem is done. People need to see it up front. And on the equity space, there's now a sufficient history. So now we have track records of equity investment funds that are stellar, that are statistically outperforming in different regions. So, for instance, Nordea's Emerging Stars Fund, Quotient's fund in New York, large cap for CalPERS over 5 years, hundreds of basis points better than the benchmark, and a few others. And we do show them now to really make the case, practically speaking, there's much reality. There's not only academics showing that you can outperform with sophisticated measures in every asset class, but actually practically there are equity funds with track records that are stellar. And as you can imagine, for instance, Nordea's Emerging Stars Fund over 3 years, 11 winning quarters, 1 losing quarter. The inflows after they had this 3-year history were dramatic and came from places where Nordea doesn't even have sales staff. So in that sense, I'm hoping that in this room will be the people who we can show in 4 or 5 years with stellar track records on fixed income funds. And if you believe that you already have one, let me know. We are then testing if it's statistically significant. And if it is, we're very happy to display that at research, innovation, and stewardship type events. So saying that we're hoping to get stellar fixed income track records, I should also briefly say when we analyze globally all SRI fixed income funds that existed over the last 15, 20 years, we test 3 different proxies of expertise for what differentiates between the good ones and the bad ones. And we test the assets under management in SRI of the fund management company. Doesn't differentiate on fixed income, does differentiate on equities. We test the number of screens, doesn't. We test engagement, and engagement does differentiate. Those firms, funnily, where the fund management firm has a substantial engagement program, it seems to benefit their fixed income funds. I can't say that it's necessary engagement. It could also be simply resources. If you have an engagement team, normally that costs some money and you have resources. But there is something about engagement in fixed income and that working paper is available. At that point, I'll introduce the audience very briefly, and then I'll go directly into questions for each of the members of the audience. So on the outside is Archie Beeching. He introduced himself already excellently. He's a senior manager of fixed income workstream at the PRI. Next to Archie is Rob Fernandez, Vice President of Breckinridge Capital Advisors. And then there's Fassil Michael, Executive Director of ISS. And we're very pleased, given Sona's opening words, that Fassil has decided short notice to fill in for Bill Mills, who unfortunately couldn't make this date. Archie, could you start off telling us what PRI signatories do in terms of engagement, both on the equity and the fixed income side?
Yeah, thanks, Andreas. I just wanted to take a step back. I put up on the slide here PRI's definition of engagement. It won't be a surprise to you, but a lot of what I'm going to do today is referring back to PRI's reporting framework. So for those of you who are not signatories or not responsible for doing your reporting, I'm sure you'll know if you are. But our reporting framework is really the only obligation for our signatories to complete on an annual basis to explain how they are approaching responsible investment, what their responsible investment activities are. And within that framework for shareholders, there is an active ownership section which looks at how you approach engagement and voting. Within the fixed income module, we have similar questions, but they don't go to quite the same extent. But within the framework, we have a definition of engagement, which is that of interactions between investor and current or potential investees. And importantly, this may include companies, governments, municipalities, and so on ESG issues. And the reasons for engaging are fairly obvious. They're for influencing a company's exposure to a particular risk. And they're also for disclosure, and I think that's absolutely core here. Disclosure is probably the number one reason for engagement. It's actually just simply finding out more information from a company on their management of particular risks and indeed opportunities, and simply finding out how a company addresses these issues, what their attitude is, what their response to certain questions even is a very good indicator of management quality that we talked about so much on the first panel. So I'm regretting now having Andreas present on the first panel before me. He's making this slide look a lot more basic. I'm not an academic. I go for simple yes-no questions. So within the reporting framework, we ask shareholders how many of you engage, essentially. And I should caveat this is data from our last reporting cycle. So we've just finished this cycle. We haven't processed that data. So this is from 2014. So out of 814 signatories that completed that framework, 578 manage more than 10% in equities and therefore had to complete the module on active ownership there. And so 70% indicated that they engage in the equity space. So then, as I said, in the fixed income module, we ask a very similar question: how many of you engage? Unfortunately, that module is a voluntary one at the moment. It won't be in future. But as I say, that's just a sign of how things have progressed over the last 2 years since we developed the framework. So in the fixed income space, 50% say they engage corporates, 31% do not engage, and 19% chose not to respond to this indicator because it's voluntary. And then I've just put up there as well for comparison in the sovereign space on the right, so you can see how many engage in that space. So there's a clear indicator there, but I personally don't think this is the best signal that we can get. I think everyone would agree with me here that bondholders are not engaging to the same extent. And simply, this is a signal of the overlap between diversified fund managers that manage both equities and bonds that are saying that they're engaging with companies that they also own debt in. So that's the basic overview from PRI's reporting data.
Archie, thank you very much. Rob, the most crucial question on this panel. Engagement, well-defined in equities. How did you guys get into it, and how are you doing it?
Yeah, happy to talk about that. Before I got into corporate engagement and municipal engagement, which will be topic of much discussion during our panel, in thinking about this conference and the topic of this particular panel discussion, I just thought it'd be important that we bring our frustrations about this past winter directly to Mother Nature. And you can hear the frustrations echoed and discussed throughout the day, but most concerning about her and her operations is social-related risks and how her operations impacted the well-being of the Boston area community. So Breckinridge is very frustrated about this, and so we're going to post this engagement on a PRI's Engagement Clearinghouse, and we're hoping others will sign on. Just a little introduction. But as far as engagement at Breckinridge, it started formally about 2 years ago. We are doing engagement with fixed income issuers, both corporations and municipalities. We're doing it with two main objectives in mind. Number one, really, to gain a better understanding of these municipalities and companies. By having these direct dialogues, we learn more about their ESG practices, as well as their priorities and policies. And then the second goal is to encourage greater disclosure and transparency. And kind of like Archie said, by having these dialogues, we see it as a real indicator of management quality, how the conversations we have either with investor relations people at companies or officials at municipalities says a lot about their priorities and says a lot about management quality. This particular slide just summarizes our engagement process, how we think about engagement at Breckinridge in three phases. And how we've been doing this the last couple of years is we've hired interns to help facilitate conversations and help generate additional ESG-related analysis. So in conjunction with an intern group, we choose a theme, we identify key issues that we want to learn more about, both with companies and municipalities, and we have our real focus is about materiality. We want to understand what are considered what both the company or municipality considers to be material risks, and weigh that against what we think is material as well. As part of the pre-call work, we prepare questionnaires, and then a lot of times we send these questionnaires, the list of questions that we prepared, to management of both municipalities and companies. Not always, but a lot of times, and in a lot of cases, this has really helped our dialogues and helped the conversations, because they can get the right people on the other end of the call. We had a call with, for example, with Caterpillar 2 years ago, and they ended up having 7 people on their end of the phone call, someone from legal, someone from health and safety, investor relations, sustainability. So it's helpful to have these questionnaires kind of sent out ahead of time. And then, so that's the pre-call, and then we have the call. We look to hold the call with investor relations people initially, but our preference is to talk to someone in the sustainability department at a company. We learn a lot more about their work. And then, as I mentioned, we want to gain an understanding about the sustainability, ESG practices of a company. So to get that, to get a real good understanding, we also articulate our interest. We say that we as investors care about these factors, and they are part of our credit research process. And when we communicate this, we get a lot of really interesting feedback from companies as well as municipalities. Oftentimes, an investor relations person has said, "Oh, this is the first time a bondholder has talked to us about ESG," or "This is the first investor at all that we've heard about this year about ESG." So we feel that it's really been worthwhile and productive to have these conversations, because we're communicating these interests, and by doing this, the companies will hopefully respond even more. And so we discuss our questions, and then the final phase of engagement at Breckinridge is the post-call. We summarize our takeaways in an Excel-based spreadsheet, so that they're archived for future use. The analysts can reflect on it and go back to it for future calls. Then we also look to leverage the content, leverage the information that we've learned in reports, so that can be shared internally with other analysts or PMs and traders, so we can all learn from these calls, and everyone can kind of gain something from it. And then we also look to synthesize what we're learning into external commentaries or white papers, and we've published 2 of those papers recently, and I think there should be links to these papers that will be provided. So those are the 3 phases, and that's kind of an overview of what engagement looks like at Breckinridge.
Thank you very much, Rob. Fassil, working for a key player in the industry, can you tell us how engagement makes a difference?
Yeah, sure. Yes, absolutely. Based on our experience at ISS with equity, on the equity side, I would say that engagement certainly makes a difference, and there are a few indicators that we could take a look at. First, the evolving governance practice around issuers over the past several years is a good indicator. To look at a couple of stats, for example, in the accountability and oversight area, just a few years ago, the majority of U.S. companies had staggered, or what we call classified boards, where directors were insulated from accountability on an annual basis. Well, today, 75% of S&P 500 companies and 60% of Russell 3000 have annually elected boards accountable to shareholders on an annual basis. Similarly, several years ago, a majority vote standard for election of directors was almost unheard of in the U.S. context. Internationally, we had certainly majority vote standard for electing corporate directors, but in the U.S., we used a plurality system, which essentially means outside of proxy contest, certainly corporate directors that are running unopposed will be elected with just 1 vote. Today, 85% of S&P 500 companies and 40% of Russell 3000 firms have adopted majority vote standard and eliminated plurality. So there are similar stories, not as dramatic as this one, but on the pay side with greater disclosure, as well as improved practices that you can point to that shows that engagement makes a difference, particularly as governance evolution indicates. Another area we could look at is the shareholder proposal process. In 2014, nearly 40% of environmental social related shareholder proposals were withdrawn from the filing with the SEC precisely because of successful engagement. And in fact, since 2008, more than 1,000 environmental social related shareholder proposals have been withdrawn. That's about 44% of them have been withdrawn because of negotiated settlements between the investors that have these environmental social questions and management where they come to the middle ground. Another example that one could look at is boardroom behavior. We are witnessing a paradigm shift in the market, in the boardroom specifically, where boards are factoring in shareholder concerns into their consideration. And in fact, directors are oftentimes out meeting with investors. And a few years ago, when we met with companies, generally the engagement team from companies would be the executives and their advisors. Today, you would be meeting with independent lead directors, the chairs of different committees, and other directors that are interested in directly talking to investors and getting that input. And because of that direct interaction between directors and their shareholders, definitely that input is influencing the boardroom. As you know, we look at thousands of proxies every year. And every year we are seeing an increasing number of proxy statements that reference specifically engagement when they describe changes that they are adopting or clarifications that they're making or additional disclosure that they're providing. So every year engagement is cited by companies specifically as an impetus or catalyst for change that they're making. The last point that I would make is that engagement is not a one-way street. What we found is that investors also benefit a lot from that conversation because they're able to get company-specific insights and context around different issues that they wouldn't otherwise get just from company filings and looking at financial statements, et cetera. So certainly not just the companies are benefiting and making some changes, but also investors are understanding companies better in terms of their unique circumstances and issues that are taking place there. And as a result, they may understand and support management during difficult times. So it's really a two-way street, and engagement is certainly making a difference on the equity side.
Fassil, thank you very much. In posing the next question to Rob, I'd like to reflect a little bit on Governor the Treasurer's words. She said two things. First of all, data is very key, and financial data science certainly is on the horizon. And the other thing she was talking about is basically fundraising for states and municipalities. And on one of the things which we could never analyze because there isn't any data, there's no ratings of municipalities I'm aware of, are municipalities. So Rob, what did you learn in particular from your engagement with municipalities?
Well, to your point, Andreas, we have created internally our own kind of proprietary methodology to assess ESG risks in municipalities. And we use these methodologies for investment selection and investment eligibility. So there's no external ESG rating provider, but we have created one on our own. So
that's original, highly original?
This next slide kind of summarizes some of the takeaways that I summarized here for both corporations and U.S. water utilities. And it summarizes some of the things that we learned from our engagement project last year, which was assisted or kind of worked on by both the credit group as well as the 3 interns that we had working for us that summer. So for corporations, we spoke with 25 companies across 6 sectors. We looked to speak to our larger holdings. We didn't pick any particular sector in particular. At this point, it's kind of on a rotating basis which companies or industries we're looking to speak to. But we wanted to look at, at this point, a broad base of companies. We discussed both company-specific ESG as well as industry-specific ESG issues and credit-related questions. Just a few takeaways from the corporate calls on the left side of the slide. 75% of the companies in the sample have water reduction targets. That alone doesn't sound particularly exciting, but one kind of follow-up to this is that in sectors where water is considered a material issue, food and beverage, utilities, all those companies had targets, and generally they were pretty ambitious. So they saw that reducing this environmental kind of externality was important to them, and we saw that was a good thing. It was a good thing for us to see. The next point, 56% of companies have assigned board members to oversee ESG issues. So we ask company-specific questions, but we also ask kind of the same question to each company we spoke to, just to basically survey their perspectives on particular points. There was a really interesting article in Harvard Business Review last year talking about how companies that have a board-level committee focused on sustainability, and they highlighted Nike and everything that they've done since the child labor issues from a couple decades ago. It can have a real important impact on a company's operations and strategy. So that's what we were kind of getting at with this question. So, and in the Harvard Business Review article, they noted that only 10% of companies, I think it was in the U.S., had this board-level committee. We found about the same percentage, but more favorably, 56% of companies do have a board member that's taking a look at ESG. So they may not have a committee, but they're at least thinking about it. And kind of a negative is that of the 25 companies we talked to, we asked each one of them whether they were quantifying the effects or the positive financial gains from sustainability ESG initiatives. And only one out of the 25 companies actually said that they were, and that was Praxair, the industrial gas company. And they talked about how they have a very, very extensive environmental management as well as data collection system where they're able to aggregate the work that they're doing on ESG across their operations and put a financial kind of number to it. And then they generally will disclose that number in quarterly earnings or investor conference slide decks. So they're proud of that number, and it's nice to see that at least one company is. And then last summer, we also, in addition to speaking to companies, we had an engagement effort with U.S. water utilities in southwestern United States, and as well as California. We ended up talking to 25 systems. The purpose of the calls was to get a better understanding of how utilities were managing through this drought. So we were 2 or 3 years into the drought last year. It's only getting worse this year. We found that generally utilities were well positioned at that point. They were doing a lot to manage through the drought issues. And some of the takeaways here is that the majority of utilities have multiple sources of water available to them. All utilities have a drought contingency plan, and they're looking to update those plans. So they're doing a lot of kind of work to manage through these risks right now. But a kind of a key takeaway for us was that although they were well positioned then, if this drought does continue, there could be some real challenges, and those are challenges that we're going to continue to monitor. So I guess that's another point just to mention is that we feel that the research that we're doing, is supplementing and enhancing our credit research. We're learning more about companies than maybe we're learning about or reading about in other places. So the research does have a real impact on our credit assessments.
Thank you very much. Coming back to Fassil and following up from what you just said, one of my very good friends engages globally for a London firm, and he told me a funny anecdote, which is they went to Russia to a factory in a very polluted town. And the point was to tell a Russian company not to pollute the Siberian environment. At face value, it looked like a pointless flight. When they actually arrived, they realized that the Russian management didn't speak particularly good English, but they were highly interested in the arguments. And they appeared initially to just take the arguments on board and said, please give us all your documents, and we're going to go and tell Moscow that we need to clean up. For a day, they didn't believe it. After returning, they realized that the Russian managers of that factory lived in the same town. They wanted the town cleaner, and they needed arguments from Moscow to change it. So sometimes you see things which are quite unusual. Fassil, in that sense, can you give us examples of very effective engagement that you're aware of?
Yeah, sure. So first, in terms of kind of broad trends around engagement in the equity space, you can divide engagement that we've seen kind of in two different eras. One is pre-Dodd-Frank mandated say-on-pay vote, and the other era is post-Dodd-Frank. And certainly, after the say-on-pay vote was mandated, issuers felt compelled to explain their pay programs and provide context to their investors. And that led to a significant increase in the amount of engagement. And certainly, engagement has evolved beyond just pay to a number of different other topics. So if you look at it globally, both in Europe as well as here in the U.S., pay is certainly an area of topic for conversation, but also board issues such as director evaluation, director skills, the nomination process, gender diversity, skills diversity, succession planning is a very hot topic among institutional investors that engage. And outside of core ESG issues, they also engage on company performance, strategy, M&A, et cetera. So the broad trend is that there are a number of different areas that institutional investors are interested in and engaging with issuers about. To cite a couple of specific examples, I think GE comes to mind because there has been a multi-year engagement between shareholders and the company. Back in 2010, shareholders raised concerns at GE about equity awards that were made to the CEO, Emmelt, as well as the misalignment between pay and performance. And GE, to its credit, engaged with shareholders and made some changes. And in fact, in their filing, when they were making changes, they indicated that they were making changes because a number of constructive conversations with their share owners. And the type of changes that they announced were the inclusion of performance-based vesting conditions for the CEO, not just on a prospective basis, but retroactively, in fact. And subsequently, additional engagements with investors indicated that the compensation committee was going to disclose additional information, including specific performance goals and targets for the CEO for previous awards, long-term awards, so that shareholders are able to assess the linkage between pay and performance adequately. More recently, with grassroots movement around proxy access, the ability for shareholders to nominate candidates to the board, recently GE announced that it was going to adopt a proxy access provision to allow shareholders to do that. So there has been kind of a sustained multi-year conversation between shareholders and GE that has resulted in concrete changes that investors can see. Talking about proxy access, recently a number of other companies have announced changes. For example, Citigroup, Bank of America, about 45 or so companies have either adopted proxy access for their shareholders or have announced to do so in the very near future. And so there's a lot of engagement that is taking place, not just in the governance space, but also on environmental social issues. We are seeing, for the first time almost in the past several years, shareholder proposals around environmental social proposals getting majority support. 6 proposals, for example, on political contribution and lobbying disclosure received majority support. And the proportion of ENS proposals receiving more than 30% support has grown from 1% in 2000 to over 30%, getting on average 30% support. There's investor focus, and the key thing is a combination between active ownership, engagement, and the vote. those three things are interrelated, and certainly engagement is though emerging as a key factor to drive changes. And in fact, some investors have indicated that a negative vote on a proxy essentially means a failed engagement. And that's the context through which equity investors are looking at some of these issues.
Fassil, thank you very much. A lot of very clear information from clear expertise. Archie, looking at the room, what can you recommend everybody? What can people do if they want to engage after this discussion?
Yeah, I'll come to that. I just wanted to take a step back. First of all, we had an event very similar to this in London last year, but this panel was probably the most different. So we did a panel on engagement, and I wanted to have a debate. And the main question was obviously, can bondholders engage? Is it appropriate for them to engage given their position in the capital structure? Is it possible a company's even going to listen to their bondholders? Will they just say, well, someone else is going to buy our bond, particularly in this climate? And we haven't really asked that question. I tried to manufacture the panel. We had one guy who said he'd say whatever I wanted him to say. We had someone from Hermes EOS doing their service, and he was the chair, but he was actually probably doing more talking than anyone else. But I would still question, because this is probably going to be my job for next year, is looking at how we can help our signatories to engage with as bondholders. And I'm sort of questioning that a lot, of whether this is an appropriate thing to do, whether it's where PRI can focus most of its efforts in the fixed income space. So I guess want to know, and maybe we can have a vote, and certainly I'd like you to come up to me afterwards and let me know, do you think this is a realistic ask? Obviously, what Breckinridge is doing is working. It's intensive by all reports. It takes a lot of resource. It takes a lot of interns, certainly. But is it something that we should really focus on? And I like the argument that companies, they get a surprise when the bondholder engages. They're used to talking to shareholders, the investor relations team, acting as gatekeeper, are used to talking to investors. But when the CFO gets a call from a repeat buyer of their bond, someone they've got a good relationship with, who says, well, next time you come to refinance, we'll think twice about it, that there's a surprise factor there, and maybe that won't last forever. Maybe that'll be diluted over time. But that's what I like about that. In terms of what you can do, I think start small. Obviously, as I said, it is intensive. There's got to be some kind of prioritization here. So I read through, there's a free text box after the yes-no question that I showed you earlier, and I read through maybe 300 responses to those from our signatories to try and pick out interesting aspects. But in terms of how people prioritize their engagements, they're obviously thinking about the severity and the materiality of the ESG-related issue to their investment performance, to the creditworthiness of the issuer. They're obviously thinking about their relative ticket size in that issuer. They're thinking about their own reputation, how it's going to affect them as an investor. And then they're thinking about the likely outcome of how important is this, and how likely are we to get a reaction here. What else? I think it's really important to communicate what you're doing in the engagement space to your clients if you're a fund manager. There's no point in doing this, putting a huge amount of effort into it and not getting something out of it yourselves. But also, I think it's that really forces people to think clearly about how they're going to do it. If you put a policy statement on how you engage as a bondholder within your responsible investment material, within your marketing material, wherever it may be, I think that's a good way of focusing the mind. I think the monitoring aspect is absolutely key if you're going to do this. If you're not checking up on how impactful this effort's been, then it's potentially a lot of wasted effort. So it's important to do that. I wanted to give an example, if I may, if there's time, from a German signatory of ours, KfW Bank. You're probably all familiar with it. One of the largest, or known as the safest bank in the world, I believe, given that they're backed up. Andreas is not saying anything. Very good of you. So they manage a 20 billion euro liquidity portfolio, all in credit. And their approach, which is, I'm not saying this is for everyone, they're a development bank, they have particular drivers and goals in this space, but they score all the issuers in their potential universe using a third-party research provider's data. And so they have a ranking system, and they split those issuers into the top 20%, the middle 60%, and the bottom 20%. And then they have a maximum investable amount in these issuers. And then if those issuers fall into the bottom 20%, they will reduce that investable amount by 30%. If they're in the middle 60, they'll reduce it by 10%. The most important thing here, the engagement aspect of this. So it's essentially a best-in-class approach on ESG. It's a way of weighting their or skewing their portfolio based on ESG scores. But then they take those results, and every year they send a letter to every single issuer, and they say, look, you've scored here. This is the methodology we use to score you on ESG, and this is why we cannot invest as much as we maybe like to. And they've had a huge reaction to that, particularly from the financial space, who I guess were not thinking these issues were so material to them and didn't realize they were being scored and were really interested to know how they were being scored. And they've, I think we'll be able to publish some data on this in a case study later in the year, but they got a huge reaction from it. A lot of these companies have put in place good ESG or CSR policies since then, and they're really reacting to it. So it was something that happened literally over a couple of years, and it's already having big results. So that's an interesting way of looking at it.
Thank you, Archie, for the very nice and thoughtful final words from the panel. Any questions? We have time for a few questions. Yeah, at the end there, and then down here. Oh, no, I see one more. Yeah.
After you. I don't know if it is on. Molly Patorne with Federal Street Advisors. And this is a question for you, Rob, and goes to Archie's point about monitoring. I'm wondering if you guys have any plans as intern season comes up again to follow up with any of these issuers and see if the asks that you guys put to them last year have taken hold and maybe some change has come about that you wouldn't have expected. And then the other question is around California. You mentioned that you spoke to some water issuers in California. The situation there is only getting a little bit more difficult. How are you guys thinking about that issue?
Great questions, Molly. So to your first question about following up with companies, yeah, we definitely intend to do that. I think at this point we kind of have a cycle of sectors and industries we're looking at periodically. And I should also mention that the interns are helping facilitate these calls, but we also have been doing these kinds of corporate and ESG engagement calls, not just during the summer, throughout the year. So it's an ongoing process for us. I think where the interns really help out is just getting in touch with investor relations, preparing, doing a lot of kind of the administrative work, and then they do a lot of writing as well to summarize what we've learned and put it into papers. But so we do, yes, so we absolutely do intend to follow up with companies. We certainly learned and certainly have read about how engagement is more effective and it's a much more positive and kind of collaborative effort all around by continuing the conversation, not just calling once and then them never hearing from us again. So yeah, we absolutely plan to do that. And then secondly, as far as California, yeah, the credit group continues to monitor what's going on there, following news stories. There has been research that's been out recently by, I think, S&P about water-related issues in California and how they may impact the utilities and systems. So I think right now the way we look at it at Breckinridge is that we're focused on doing bottom-up research. We want to get to know and know these issuers one by one, so the analysts are doing that and also considering drought and water scarcity and security while thinking about that analysis. We would never, at this point, we're not looking to sell out of a whole area just because we're concerned. We're focused on doing that fundamental research. So it's part of what we're doing. It's part of what we're considering.
Thank you, Rob. The lady in the first row.
Very good. Thank you. Do I have this on? Yes, very good. Not to put two of you on the spot at once, but my question is about transparency. And as an observation, we could say that your engagement data is similar in nature to the Occam data, and perhaps is some of the best data we have available. Henry and I were visiting earlier about data being such a problem in this area. And my question is, and what I'm wondering, is if there may be a social media side of this, and if you would entertain the idea of sharing or making some of this data freely available. And in contrast, I might mention, and I'm sure many of you are aware, that B Corp has a policy of keeping their engagement data entirely confidential. That never gets out in the free world, if you would. And I think it's very much of an issue for all of us trying to use the data. And I would just appreciate hearing your thoughts about how we can get some of this engagement data more widely available. Thank you.
I'll answer on behalf of PRI. There is an investor engagement clearinghouse within PRI. Every signatory can see the data. Every signatory can copy and paste it from the platform. And so there are dates there. It can be managed. It can be worked up for financial data science and so forth. With respect to individual organizations, anybody wants to add something to it?
I mean, I was just generally speaking about institutional investor engagement. In terms of ISS, the type of engagement that we do with companies that we engage quite a bit, about 3,000 or so globally, is very different than institutional investor engagement. Our engagement is more to support our research process, to explain our policies, et cetera, rather than to effectuate change necessarily. We're just a service provider. But we do engage, and we make our engagement information available in our research report. Where we say who we engaged with and what the topics of conversation were, if there were outcomes, what the outcomes were, et cetera. But I would definitely say that the engagement that we do is very, very different from institutional investor engagement, which is looking to effectuate change. We are looking to support our research process and to have information that's beyond just a proxy statement, annual reports, et cetera.
Thank you, Fassil. We'll take 3 more questions. There's a lady there, there's a gentleman in the back, and there is the statue lady over there.
Cheryl Smith with Trillium Asset Management. My question's for Archie, and it deals with the structural issue. You were asking whether engagement is something that should be asked of bond investors. And it strikes me that in the United States, particularly the SEC's rules about what is necessary for for being able to file a shareholder proposal is $2,000 held for a year, which gives a great amount of leverage to a small investor. I wish I were the size of Breckinridge. I wish I were the size of State Street. I'm not. And so with a bond investor where there is not in any way that leverage, or the KFW, that'd be lovely too, to say, well, I will not invest $1 million in you if you don't, where you don't have the same leverage that you have with the equity. And I wonder if you could talk about the institutional structures and how we might address that as a community.
Yeah, absolutely. I asked this question about engagement to the Norwegian government pension fund, and they said, well, it doesn't matter if we own them or not. We call up and everyone listens to us. We say what we like. So the other end is really what Andreas mentioned. I see PRI as a great organisation that can bring groups of investors together on these issues. The PRI clearinghouse is very effective at the moment for shareholders. There's this sort of cultural thing we've got to get around. We're going to rename it because the name doesn't make a lot of sense at the moment itself. But the idea is that we get groups of investors together who want to engage with a company, a sector, a group. We've got others. There's an investor in Australia engaging with muni issuers there. So there's a lot of people really interested in this. We've just got to set this up and develop a culture where bondholders are happy to get together and engage on a particular issue. And there's a structural issue also with companies not knowing who their bondholders are necessarily once their bonds are traded. And I know there's platforms that are now allowing people to find out and anonymously signaling that they want to engage on a particular topic, but it's not an ESG platform per se. It's purely a financial system at the moment. But I've been speaking to them a lot about how we could sort of introduce the ESG aspect to that, so you could plug in your identifiers, find out who else in the market is interested in engaging on a particular topic and taking it from there. There's a lot of potential, and that's what I want to focus on at the beginning of next year. It's just I'm trying to get a sense of whether people would react to that.
Thank you, Archie. The gentleman in the back.
Hi, this is Randy O'Neill from MSCI. And I think there's a bit of a follow-up question to Cheryl's question, and also something that, Archie, you had mentioned earlier, but it's a direct question for Rob, and feel free for any of you to chime in, which is really the relationship between you and your clients. So, on the equity side, we've seen time and time again that managers will work directly with their clients on engagement issues. And I'm just wondering if you have, a set strategy to not only make your clients aware of what you're up to on the engagement side, but also try to leverage the power of their assets to move your cause along.
Yeah, that's a good point, Randy. At this point, how we've chosen to share the work that we're doing is both through kind of white papers and commentaries that we publish on our website and distribute to clients. And then also it's a lot of conversations with the advisors that we work with and consultants so they can share with their end clients as well. So it's more been about discussions. At this point, unlike equity managers, we haven't done a collaboration with an end client on a particular engagement. That could be possible down the road, but currently the way we're focused on it is it's a way of enhancing our credit and ESG research. So we're thinking about materiality and kind of it's all about supplementing our what we're doing now, supplementing the fundamental research that we're already doing. But it's a good point. Other equity managers certainly do collaborate with their clients, and that could be something that happens down the road.
Thanks, Rob. The final question over there.
Hi, Raki Kumar from State Street Global Advisors. I head up the stewardship program at SSGA, and I'm trying to strengthen our oversight of our fixed income assets. So, Rob, who do you actually talk to in municipalities when you're talking about ESG issues? Is it the treasurer? Is it somebody in a particular office?
So at this point, we've had two kind of formal engagements with U.S. municipalities. First summer, it was with kind of local governments, cities and counties to learn more firsthand about the sustainability work that they're doing. And in that case, it was a sustainability officer. You're seeing more and more of those kinds of positions at the county, city level across the country. So there could be the director of engineering or someone who's focused on community welfare-related programs. So that was the first summer. So it was kind of hit or miss to some degree as we learned at the city or county, but when there was a sustainability officer available, we had really good, kind of rich conversations. This past summer, when we were talking with water utilities, it would be maybe the head of engineering. Also could have been a sustainability person. But one thing I would want to mention is that when we got in touch with someone and had conversations, they were always very excited to share all the work that they were doing. They talked about how the media there would be news stories covering how severe the issue is and currently is, but they were excited to be able to say one-on-one with an investor that all these great initiatives that they were covering. So they were excited to share those stories. So at the water system level, it was an engineer, sustainability people, again, maybe health and safety as well. But I can follow up with more information.
So let's please thank our panel for the excellent discussion and, more importantly, for the excellent work they are doing on which they're reporting, because that's much harder than talking to you for an hour. Thank you very much.